with some brand new details in the Idaho college student murders.
And prosecutors are publicly linking University of Idaho murder suspect Bryan Kohberger's DNA to the crime scene.
Accused killer Bryan Kohberger is a statistical match to DNA recovered from the knife sheath.
New court filings show Kohberger's DNA is a match to a knife sheath investigators found at the home.
This is a probable cause affidavit, and they don't have to lay out their whole case here. They just have to make up probable cause.
This is Reporter Room with Jessica Della Davies.
Hello, Reporter Room investigators. We have so much stuff to get into. We're going to be talking about Bryan Kohberger, Ann Taylor, and her latest defense strategies. She has got to convince one juror that Bryan Kohberger is the most unlucky person in the whole world. We're going to be talking about Bryan Kohberger. The defense's claim that he was somewhere, that someone knew where he was, but they don't want to tell the prosecution. No. They had 30 days to provide an alibi. That was extended. This is Ann Taylor just getting her narrative out to prospective jurors. We are going to dig into that 8-hour time gap, the roommates, Dylan and Bethany, and new information on a friend of Ethan's. Welcome to the hundreds of new subscribers who have joined Reporter Room over the past several weeks. We are grateful you are here. Also, Bryan is innocent until proven guilty, but because Bryan is the one indicted, arrested, sitting in jail, and who hasn't provided an alibi, for the purposes of this video, I will be discussing this case in terms of Bryan Kohberger. July 24th was the last day that Bryan Kohberger had to provide his alibi to the prosecution. The prosecution had to turn over everything to the defense, and the defense then had a window of time to provide an alibi. Well, they got an extension, and this turned into weeks and weeks of an extension. So I think that the court has bent over backwards for Bryan Kohberger, in my opinion. July 24th was the deadline for Bryan to provide this alibi. He didn't do it. The day came and went. We were all on alibi watch, but no alibi was remitted by Ann Taylor on behalf of Bryan Kohberger. For weeks, we all waited with anticipation for Bryan to produce this all-important alibi. Remember, after the prosecution turned over discovery back in May, the defense was supposed to provide Bryan's alibi within 10 days. But Judge John Judge gave Bryan an extension, and boy, Bryan got a massive extension. And to what end? Did Bryan ever provide an alibi? No. And I'm going to talk about Ethan's friend, Dylan and Bethany, and that 8-hour time gap with some new information in just a moment, so please stay with me. Everything I'm sharing with you is my opinion, and opinions are not facts, so please don't send any negativity to anyone. Let's be kind to each other. This video is for educational and entertainment purposes only, so please subscribe, hit the notification bell, and give this video a thumbs up so I know you were here. The judge gave Bryan an extra 8+ weeks so the defense could get Bryan's alibi together and provide it to the prosecution. In fact, the judge gave Ann Taylor and Bryan's defense team all the way through July 24th to provide that all-important alibi that the defense claimed they needed an extension for. And after 8 weeks, absolutely nothing was provided to the prosecution. So for people who believe that Bryan doesn't need to provide an alibi, that the burden is on the prosecution, you're right. Bryan is innocent until proven guilty. However, if Bryan didn't have an alibi, then why all this drama and game playing by the defense for this extension for him to actually provide one? Why not just tell the prosecution right up front that he's not going to provide an alibi because he doesn't have to? These are defense tactics, in my opinion. And I've been saying for weeks that I felt like Ann Taylor and Bryan's defense team were speaking to prospective jurors through their motions and trying to circumvent the gag order to get Bryan's defense story out into the public. This delay was all about creating a narrative that Bryan actually had an alibi, and it would be coming really soon. Ann Taylor has been awesome about getting her narrative out. She even managed to try to change the wording on the knife sheath from being left to placed. She wants to try to allude to the fact that law enforcement has somehow decided to frame this guy, Bryan Kohberger, that nobody had ever heard of, that had no relation that we knew, that anyone knew of, to the victims, when it would have been so much easier for law enforcement, as I've shared with you in past videos, to pin this on Jack DeCour, who was Kaylee's ex-boyfriend. They could have pinned it on one of the two roommates, Bethany or Dylan. They were actually in the house. They could have pinned it on Bryan Kohberger. He's not here to defend himself, so why not pin it on him? No, they didn't. They really did try to get, in my opinion, the person who did this. So I'm going to talk about Ethan's friend, some new information on that, Dylan and Bethany. We're going to address that 8-hour time gap that's been bothering so many of you guys in just a moment. So please stay with me. But first, is Bryan allowed to provide an alibi later during the actual trial? Well, the taxpayers of Idaho are paying to fund both the prosecution and the defense. So they're paying for Bryan's entire defense team. The thought behind it is that the state of Idaho is spending all of this money on both defense and prosecution attorneys, their investigations, only for the trial to actually begin, jurors be selected and seated, and then find out that Bryan had an alibi the whole time. The purpose of doing this is to save money for the good people of Idaho. So that's why it was important for the defense to provide this alibi in a timely manner. It saves money for taxpayers in Idaho who are paying for this trial. So all the defense has told us is, quote, evidence corroborating Mr. Kohberger's not being at the location other than the 1122 King Road house will be disclosed. End quote. So they've had weeks and weeks to provide this alibi, and as I've been sharing with you, awesome viewers, if Bryan had an alibi, he would have submitted it back on December 30th of 2022 when he was first arrested. He would not have sat in jail for nearly 7 months. And Ann Taylor is a great defense attorney. I give her lots of credit. She's doing a wonderful job of getting Bryan's narrative out there to prospective jurors through her defense motions. She's trying to raise reasonable doubt. She's trying to claim that there's no victim DNA in Bryan's office, car, or home. However, we only have Ann Taylor's and the defense team's word on this. And in my opinion, she sacrificed some credibility with this alibi delay nonsense. So this alibi would have had to have featured something along the lines of where Bryan was, and then law enforcement would have tried to figure out if he really was there or not there. This is why they needed time to do that. I think that that would have been a really strong element in the legal defense, but I don't think that Ann Taylor can go through with that. I don't think he does have an alibi, and worse still, his phone is pinging in the area of the crime scene. So what is she left with? Her best play is to convince the jury that Bryan is the most unlucky person in the whole wide world. So let's consider what Ann Taylor is not saying, because sometimes what someone doesn't say is just as important as what someone actually does say. So Ann Taylor and the defense team, they are not claiming that Bryan's DNA was not at the 1122 King Road house crime scene. Ann Taylor and the defense team are not claiming that the touch DNA on the knife sheath does not belong to Bryan. Ann Taylor and the defense team are not claiming that Bryan had an accomplice. And I'm going to talk about Ethan's friend, Dylan and Bethany, the two roommates, and that 8-hour time gap with some new information in just a moment. So please stay with me. So Ann Taylor has been really slick about getting the defense narrative out there, and that's her job, including claiming that the knife sheath was, quote, placed rather than, quote, left. And I say that if it was placed there, it was left as a calling card by the person who did this. And Ann Taylor and the defense team won't point to any actual problems with the grand jury evidence, with the testimony that was provided. And mind you, they have all of the transcripts. They just are writing motions to ask that the grand jury indictment be thrown out. Again, a classic constitutional defense. So Ann Taylor and the defense team have made such a big deal of alleging that the grand jury were summoned improperly, that the evidence was withheld from them from the grand jury, but yet did not present a single bit of evidence of any of this after accessing and reviewing all of the grand jury transcripts. So in June, the Latah County prosecutors announced that they would be seeking the death penalty against Bryan Kohberger. Bryan Kohberger was granted by the judge weeks and weeks of an extension for the alibi. Will he be granted also to be allowed to have a speedy trial, but delay his speedy trial? Because the prosecution seems really, really worried that Bryan is going to somehow have a motion to appeal on. And they're not wrong, because the Lori Vallow Daybell case was also in Idaho. And guess what? She did try to appeal. Bryan just happened to have photos of the victim on his cell phone. He just happened to be driving in circles around the 1122 King Road house at the time these crimes occurred. His cell phone just happened to be flipping on and off during the time frame that he would have been dextering out his car and driving to Moscow, Idaho, and then returning to Pullman, Washington, 15 minutes away. His DNA just happened to be on the snap of the knife sheath that was lying to the side and underneath of beautiful, sweet Maddie, who never deserved what happened to her, as did Kaylee, Ethan, and Xana. Bryan's car just happens to be on multiple video cameras going to and coming back from the crime scene. I feel confident that law enforcement was able to enhance them better than we could here on YouTube. And I think that there are going to be videos of him either showing the license plate, proving that it was his, or showing him driving that car. It's been really difficult for many people to see shade being thrown at the two roommates who, in my opinion's only crime was to have survived the stabbing of their three roommates and Ethan, their friend. I know there have been a lot of questions about that 8-hour time gap, and it's really sad that there are still people out there who don't seem to understand that these two roommates are stuck. They are both stuck under a gag order being imposed by the judge. So let's dig into that 8-hour time gap along with Bethany and Dylan, and then we're going to discuss Ethan's friends. So a source who claims to have spoken to Dylan claimed that she thought the sounds she heard from outside her room were late night partying. So Dylan just thought she was hearing late night partying. Remember, she was the newest roommate, and she had recently moved onto the second floor. So in fact, Dylan reportedly even shouted at her friends in the house to keep it down so she could sleep. And honestly, who hears noise like you think it's Kaylee upstairs playing with the dog and think that your four roommates are being done away with? This is not the first thing that would come into your mind if you lived in a party house and heard some noise. And as for seeing the masked man dressed in black with bushy eyebrows, we are hearing that Dylan thought that this was just a guest, or possibly the person delivering the DoorDash order. Remember, that doorbell rang and an order was delivered. Post-pandemic, which was last November, many people were still wearing masks. So let's talk about Ethan's friend. So Dylan and Bethany never did call the police in the morning, and a source has explained to News Nation that at least one of Ethan's friends stopped by the 1122 King Road home because they had plans with Ethan. This friend reportedly went to Xana's room and found Ethan and Xana. He reportedly took pulses, called 911 using either Dylan or Bethany's phone around 11:58 p.m., around 8 hours after Maddie, Kaylee, Ethan, and Xana were done away with. And I will see you next time. Please subscribe.